and welcome to our webinar today, Changing the Culture Through Culture, Artists Shifting Perspectives on Climate Change. I'm Shelley Rogers, the coordinator of Artists for the Earth at Earthsay, and we are so honored today to have with us three outstanding artists for the Earth, Mary Mattingly, Courtney Madison, and Paul Volinsky, as well as a distinguished moderator in Nora Lawrence. Thank you, all of you, for being here. We're so happy to see you and really grateful that you would participate with us today in our webinar, and greetings to our viewers who are watching today. Just a word about Earthsay.org. Earthsay was very excited this year to celebrate its 50th anniversary, which was a major milestone for the organization and a major milestone for the environmental movement as a whole. Earthsay is deeply involved in every aspect of the environment, but each year it has a special theme, and this year's theme is Restore Our Earth. And I think the artwork we're going to talk about today really addresses that theme. About Artists for the Earth, it was begun a few years ago in response to the fact that for so many years, science were just simply not getting through to the public about climate change. And there are many reasons for that. But the one that really struck me is that we don't really respond to risk to ourselves through the analytical side of our brain. We respond to risk really more through the other half of our brain, which is intuitive and imaginative. The same side of our brain that responds to art, because art is allowing us, helping us to digest or integrate what's going on in the world around us in a personal way, subjectively. So it turned out that art was a really great way of getting across climate change. And increasingly in the last decade, scientists have turned ever more to art to try to get across what they know. And artists in turn have tried to turn more and more to the science to get across what they feel is happening to our world. And when those two things come together, art and science, it is really very powerful. We are very privileged today to have with us three artists who exemplify that, because they have either worked directly with a scientist, studied the science extensively before they even went into their career as an artist, or science is just simply interwoven into everything they do artistically. We're going to see their artwork now, and then afterwards there's going to be a question and answer period. So please do send in your questions for our artists. Our moderator today is Nora Lawrence. Nora is the senior curator at the Storm King Art Center in New Windsor, New York, an extraordinary outdoor sculpture park, or I'd say museum, of over 500 acres of extraordinary art. She curates and co-curates exhibitions there, and recently, not too long ago, curated an exhibition entitled Indicators, Artists on Climate Change. And that was one of the very first exhibitions ever about art and climate science. We hope there'll be many more of them just like that. Nora came to the Storm King Art Center in 2011. Before that, she was with the Museum of Modern Art in New York, where she held curatorial positions in the painting and sculpture department, and prior to that, the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. So again, welcome to you, Nora. Thank you for being our moderator today. And I guess without further ado, we will turn the webinar over to you.
Thank you so much, and I'm really happy to be here for this great organization, Earthsay.org. And I think we all have a real affinity for all of the great work that you do there. So thank you so much, Shelley, and thank you so much, Halsey, who's behind the scenes helping us with tech and everything else, and to everyone else at Earthsay.org. Yeah, I think that a lot of what you said, Shelley, resonates with me in terms of what the power of art can be in what often ends up being a very scientific or also maybe sociological conversation. And I think it's going to be interesting both to hear from the artists that we are talking with today, and then also be able to have a conversation with them. So what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce everybody, And then we'll hear from the three artists. They'll all give a presentation. Each of them will give presentations about their work. And then we'll have some time for conversation between all of us, and then Q&A from the audience at the end. We're going to go in alphabetical order. So let me first tell you about Mary Mattingly, who is a visual artist who founded Swale, which is an edible landscape on a barge in New York City. And I know we're going to see more of this, which is exciting. Docked at public piers, but following waterways, common laws, Swale circumnavigates New York's public land laws, allowing anyone to pick free, fresh food. Swale instigated and co-built the Foodway in Concrete Plant Park in the Bronx in 2017. Mary's work has also been exhibited in Storm King as part of the exhibition that we did in 2018 called Indicators Artists on Climate Change, as well as at the International Center of Photography, the Seoul Art Center, the Brooklyn Museum, the New York Public Library, De Cordova Museum and Sculpture Park, and the Palais de Tokyo in Paris. Her work has been included in books such as the Whitechapel/MIT Press Documents of Contemporary Art series, the book titled Nature and edited by Jeffrey Kastner, and Triple Canopy Speculations, The Future Is, published by Artbook, and Henry Sayre's A World of Art, the 8th edition, published by Pearson Education Incorporated. Next, we'll hear from Courtney Madison, who handcrafts intricate and large-scale ceramic sculptural works inspired by the fragile beauty of coral reefs and the human-caused threats they face. Her work has been commissioned internationally for permanent collections, including those of the U.S. Embassy in Jakarta and Lindblad Expeditions' National Geographic Endurance ship. Her exhibition history includes solo shows at the Virginia Museum of Contemporary Art and at the U.S. Department of Commerce headquarters. In 2020, the UN Postal Administration published Madison's work on a stamp to commemorate Earth Day. Born in 1985 and raised in San Francisco, Madison received a BA in Marine Ecology and Ceramic Sculpture from Skidmore in 2008 and a MA in Environmental Studies from Brown University with thesis credits at Rhode Island School of Design in 2011. Her work has been featured in Smithsonian Magazine, on Good Morning America, in Oprah Magazine, and on the BBC. And she lives and works in Los Angeles. The third artist we'll hear from is Paul Volinsky, who is an American sculptor widely known for transforming littered cans from the city streets into large-scale abstract installations of lifelike butterflies. Over 3 decades, his wide-ranging work has engaged themes as diverse as memory, childhood, addiction and recovery, flight, nature, sustainability, and transformation. With a lifelong concern for environmental issues, his work frequently repurposes and recycles discarded materials, exploring the possibilities and narratives embedded in the worthless to surprising and poetic ends. An avid pilot, metaphors of flight and soaring, whether physical, psychological, or spiritual, often appear in his work. Paul graduated from Cooper Union, and his work has been exhibited and collected throughout the United States, and he had a recent mid-career survey called Farther, which was organized by the Taubman Museum of Art in Roanoke, Virginia. He lives and works in Queens and in the Catskills with his partner, a painter named Amy Park, and their young son, Lark. So welcome all of you, and I'm going to turn it over to Mary to get us started. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nora, and thanks, Shelley and Halsey. I guess we could share the slides and I'll begin. So you can go, yeah, thanks. So I like to say that I co-build ecosystems and really rely upon sculpture to question relationships between materials, between spaces, and one another. To me, sculpture is experiential, it's durational, and it can be alive. It's a proposal that can change perspectives and perceptions. You can go to the first slide, thanks. So I was raised in an agricultural town where the drinking water was polluted from pesticides like DDT, and water was really a continual concern. I began building sculptures that really actualized these concerns about access to basic needs, really in the form of living systems that would provide kind of a modicum of survival. In 2006, though, my focus shifted from this more intimate form of sculpture to public space, specifically to New York's harbor. And In part, I think this happened out of necessity. I thought if life was art, a self-sufficient floating island would allow me to live in a way that really met my ethics and my economic reality. I envisioned building a home that was less dependent on material supply chains that really extract from rural environments and return the leftovers as landfill. You can go to the next slide. So after a 3-year process of bureaucratic navigation and compromise, from working with officials and hundreds of school children to really redesigning the initial concept, it would look nothing like that initial sketch. A very process-oriented project reliant upon chance. WaterPod was built almost entirely from the waste chain and a barter economy. Scientists work with engineers to build systems where food, power, and water could be produced on board. And it launched in the summer of 2009, visited 12 public piers in each of the 5 boroughs for 2 weeks at a time. There was a central 30-foot tall dome, which you can see here. That was a public event space. And the structure contained rainwater collection, a kitchen, shower, a gray water purification system to be reused to water vegetable gardens, a greenhouse, 4 cabins, a dry composting toilet, and 4 chickens. You can go to the next slide. So living on board, I participated in a zero waste ecosystem that was then interrogated and crowdsourced by visitors with vast experience sets. And it became robust enough to meet our food, water, and energy needs. Over the course of the project, we met close to 200,000 people who participated in the ecosystem. So I think, WaterPod really found its power from being improvisational, from relying on strangers, and tying science to a vision. I think what I learned on the WaterPod paved the way for Swale. You can go to the next slide. So, and the next slide. So in a city where 1 in 3 persons really lives in what is considered a food desert, a swale is a reused barge in a floating food forest. Growing or picking food on public land in New York City has been illegal for almost a century. And Swale is a provocative public artwork that uses the common laws of the water as a loophole to be a platform where anyone can pick fresh foods for free. Because while some residents have access to the 100 acres of community garden space in New York City, the city really manages 30,000 acres of public parkland. So Swale built upon relationships made with local groups from the WaterPod, like Youth Ministries for Peace and Justice and the Bronx River Alliance. You could go to the next slide. And it follows traditional ecological knowledge and insights of social scientist Eleanor Ostrom, who claimed that in a vibrant commons, people have a vital role to play, not only as beneficiaries, but as co-creators, as protectors, and decision makers. So Swale's planting plan was designed by using companion planting methods and asking people over the course of the project what foods they were interested in harvesting. You can go to the next slide. So as a direct result of Swale, like Nora mentioned, and with the support of community groups, in 2017, the New York City Parks Department opened their first public foodway at Concrete Plant Park in the Bronx. This is a place where people can go 24 hours a day. It's actually a greenway, and pick foods in this 1 acre that was set aside to be a test space for edible forestry in a city like New York. You can go to the next slide. So I like to say that Swale functioned as a folly. It's a barge that resembles a landmass when you're on board. Since it was most often docked at a pier and connected to land via a gangway, it really moves with the tide. So when you're on board, surrounded by a hill and an orchard, suddenly your perspective changes, quite literally. The landmass that you're on appears to be still and the city appears to be moving. So I think it asks people to reconsider our surroundings and question them, from the soil that the foods are growing in, to the water source, to the city itself, and to question access, like clean water, fresh food should also be a human right. So swale's a tool for regenerative agriculture in an urban center. It propelled me to think about other objects that were in between art and science, in between agriculture and law. And it led me to begin this project that I'll show next called the Ecotopian Library. And you can go to the next slide. So the Ecotopian Library is a cross between a contemplative exhibition and a tool library that contains books and interactive objects that focus on world building and regenerative futures. It stems from a belief that art and ecotopian thought can cultivate social change, and that transdisciplinary work, this in-between work, is really key to future regeneration in a world that we need to coexist in. So in January 2020, the first version of Ecotopian Library was created at the University of Colorado in Boulder, which is this image. You can go to the next image. And while it was built out of my desire to locate tools that can aid in co-building, it was very place-based, and artists contributed eclectic and really story-driven sculptural objects. Environmental justice activists performed strength within loss. Students and teachers shared important literature around arts, around geology, place-based knowledge, and neighbors shared earthly matter, including fossils from Colorado's geologic plant life and herbarium samples. This is a work by Sophie Tuttle and her community extolling the hopes and fears about climate change as a sort of in a collective release as part of this performance called Ofrendas for a Dying Planet. And you can go to the next slide. And the library's contents are created with visitors. You can go to the next slide. Who may bring natural objects like earth samples along with a story that Ecotopian Library can share. So the next Ecotopian Libraries will be at the Hudson Area Library in Hudson, New York, in Wave Hill in the Bronx. I think this project really continues where art relies upon science and story to build cultural change, making tools more accessible, really triggering imagination and possibility about other ways of being in the world. And I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Mary. Courtney, would you like to start speaking? Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks, Nora, and thanks, Shelley and Earthsay.org for inviting me to be a part of this. And that was really cool, Mary. So we can go to my slides now. I'm Courtney Madison. I have a background in marine conservation biology and policy, and I use my background in coral reef field work to inform the work that I do as an artist. So we can go to the next slide. I make really large scale, gigantic ceramic sculptural works, a lot of wall installations that are inspired by the fragile beauty of coral reefs and other marine ecosystems and the human caused threats that they face. So one of the main inspirations for my work is the impacts of climate change and carbon dioxide emissions on marine environments. And I think coral reefs offer a really stark visualization of climate change because they turn white when they're impacted by warming sea temperatures. So this is the largest work I've done. This is a piece called Confluence, which is the 5th in my Our Changing Seas series that I started when I was a grad student at Brown and doing thesis work at RISD, trying to figure out how to create art, like kind of a masterpiece, whatever that meant. I didn't really know what that meant at the time, but I'm kind of experimenting and trying to figure out how to represent these ecological concepts in visually impactful forms that will get people to connect emotionally and personally to climate change issues. This work is about 28 feet tall and 18 feet wide. And it was a commission for the Office of Art and Embassies at the US State Department that was curated by Virginia Shore and Claire d'Alba in 2018 for the US Embassy in Jakarta. Next slide. This is a detail shot of that work. It's really three-dimensional. It comes off the wall about 22 inches in the center. And essentially, it's inspired by kind of like spiral patterns that repeat in nature, both through hurricanes and seashells and ocean waves and even galaxies. I think tossing coral reefs up into the air implies that their future is in the balance, and it's really up to us to determine if they will recover or perish. Next slide. So at the heart of this gigantic spiral form in this design, I really wanted to kind of evoke the feelings that I feel when I'm scuba diving on a coral reef in the wild. I think my work isn't necessarily literal. It's not anatomically correct with all the different anatomy of the species that I've studied, but it's more inspired by the aesthetics that I love most about coral reefs and how alien and bizarre these animals are. A lot of people don't realize that coral reefs are made up of tiny faceless animals, and I find that kind of really exciting and bizarre. Next slide. A lot of my work is on the wall, and I do that because I want people to feel the way I do when I'm sort of hovering over the reef. So I felt like that was a good way to give a different perspective. And the pieces, I build the work on the floor of my studio here in Los Angeles. But once I put it up on the wall, it really changes and sort of gets its own personality. So that's kind of interesting. This is a show that I was part of at the Florence Griswold Museum in Old Lyme, Connecticut last year, called Fragile Earth. Next slide. The work on the left in that last shot is called Malam Geminose, and this is a detail shot from that work. It's completely white, so not playing so much on that transition from colorful to bleached coral, but in this case, thinking about the impacts of both coral bleaching and ocean acidification deteriorating reefs. Back in 2009, when I was a grad student, the administrator of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, named Jane Lubchenco, was at the climate conference in Copenhagen, and she made a speech during which she said that ocean acidification is like the equally evil twin of climate change when it comes to coral reefs. As carbon dioxide emissions dissolve into the seawater, it makes the seawater more acidic, and it makes it harder for corals to precipitate their calcium carbonate skeletons that they use to essentially sculpt their gigantic reef forms. So thinking about that, I wanted to create a design that, we can go to the next slide, that was sort of a book-matched fractal inspired pattern that showed the two sides of coral bleaching and ocean acidification. And Dr. Lubchenco has also said that ocean acidification is sort of like osteoporosis of the sea. So that was a big inspiration for this work as well in terms of skeletal forms and just thinking about our relationships to corals. I think that we have a lot in common with them, and I somehow relate to corals, even though they're probably some of the least relatable animals on Earth. And I often feel like a coral when I'm sitting in my studio sculpting, because it's sort of a quiet, methodical process that takes a lot of time and intricate detail work, and then eventually you come up with these gigantic forms. And calcium carbonate, which the skeletons of corals are made of, also happens to be a common ingredient in ceramic materials, like my glazes. So that parallel is kind of interesting to me too. You can go to the next slide. I mentioned earlier that a lot of my work is inspired by spiral forms in nature, and I think that's a really powerful form to kind of imply that coral reefs are really in the balance and their future is up in the air. And so I was looking at other spiral forms, including like double galaxy spirals, and getting kind of out there with it. And I created this work as a private commission back, I finished it last year, but I worked on it for a couple years. It's about 17 feet wide and 11 feet tall. And I, again, was thinking about the transition from healthy, colorful, vibrant corals to sickened and bleached ones. Next slide. Essentially, when coral reefs, when reef building corals bleach, it's because it's sort of an immune response, actually. The sea temperature rises and corals can't tolerate changes in the seawater temperature more than a couple degrees, really. They're very sensitive. And so when they start getting too warm, they have a stress response that is sort of like when they have a fever. And corals have these tiny single-celled algae that live inside their tissues and photosynthesize to give them a really important food source. And they also give them their vibrant colors. So when the corals become stressed out and have to release these tiny algae called zooxanthellae back into the water, they lose their color, but they also begin to starve. And corals can recover from bleaching if that stressor is decreased quickly enough. So I think it's important to kind of emphasize that in terms of reading my work. Like, I don't want people to interpret it only pessimistically. I think it's up to us and it's up to the viewer to decide how to interpret it. Next slide. And as Shelley mentioned at the top, the United Nations Postal Administration included this work on a stamp for Earth Day for the 50th anniversary. So I thought I would toss that in here because it's sort of relevant for our conversation. Next slide. This is me in my studio. This is actually kind of be right behind me. But essentially, I think that I really agree with what Shelley said at the beginning, that art has a really immense power to inspire people to care more about these issues. And I hope that my work and the work of Mary and Paul and all of us are really going to inspire people and spark that sense of curiosity and wonder that is necessary to really decide that you're going to make choices in your life and take direct actions to protect the environment while we can, especially as climate change is looming so large. So that's it. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Courtney. Paul, would you join us?
Absolutely. Thank you all. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be part of this, especially in the company of Mary and Courtney, whose work I am really in awe of. Let's go right to the slides, I guess. I'll try to make this quick so we have time to chat. Okay. Can we go to the first slide? There we are. I have been working with discarded aluminum cans collected from the streets of New York by homeless canners for over 2 decades now. And this work originally was my attempt to make some work about the process of recovery from drug addiction and alcoholism. So over 28 years ago, I started to notice crushed beer cans littering the streets of the city, which were emblematic for me of addiction. And I collected those. And after months of exploring them as a material, I finally cut one into a butterfly shape and realized that that worked rather well for me, in that the butterfly is this worldwide symbol of transformation and rebirth. But that work, I wasn't really talking about that at that point, and that work got sort of identified as an example of recycling and upcycling litter from the streets, is sort of the cast-off detritus of urban life into artwork. This piece, which was made a few years ago, starts to veer into an interest in actual butterfly biology. And this represents about 30 species of Lepidoptera that are either extinct, endangered, or extirpated. I painted these aluminum, sort of realistically crafted aluminum silhouettes with the same paint that the gallery walls were painted with, so that the object kind of disappears, and what we're left with are the shadows of these extinct or endangered butterflies and moths. Next slide. So while I really was working with the image of a butterfly, symbolically or metaphorically for many years, it kind of led into an interest in the creatures themselves. And that occurred at the same time that I was introduced to a then 87-year-old butterfly geneticist named Rudy Mattoni, and he and I became good friends. And he led me into this project of sort of breeding and maintaining standing colonies of native butterflies in my studio, which went on for almost 3 years, 2.5 years. One of the great challenges of that is that every species basically has an individual plant, a host plant, that is the food source for the larva. So in order to have a standing colony of butterflies reproducing, you have to have those plants. And I'm sure Mary knows a great deal more about the difficulty of growing in New York City, but trying to have an indoor environment where I could raise these plants was quite challenging, and it led into this whole sort of developing this kind of hydroponic plant growth rack thing, which is pictured there. Next slide. So this is just an image of the larval state of cabbage white butterflies. I wound up building this kind of structure that I called butterfly machine that supported generations of butterflies through all of the various life stages. Next. And so here's an image of the butterfly machine or butterfly breeding laboratory in a gallery exhibition in New York. And really what I should back up and say that the impetus for doing this was a simple idea I had about making a sculpture that would incorporate live butterflies. And rather than doing it the easy way and simply ordering butterflies from a butterfly farm in Florida, I thought it would be much more interesting to go out, catch female butterflies native to New York, and then create this environment and breed them, bring that into the gallery, and then over the course of the exhibition, breed generations of butterflies, which could then go into this sculpture. And so that's what I did. But so the butterfly breeding laboratory was in a sort of back room at the gallery, and these are viewers coming to see what's going on there. And over the course of this month-long exhibition, I raised 5 different generations of 5 different species of butterflies. Next slide. And this is this figure sculpture was the impetus for that. And I had, originally had this simple idea of an image of a human being that had live butterflies in its interior space. One of the things I think about a great deal is that as human beings, we seem to have forgotten that we're animals ourselves, that we're mammals. And that kind of detachment from kingdom animalia is what lets us destroy our environment, I think. I mean, we've lost this fundamental sense of our place in the world alongside all other species. So this was my attempt to kind of make this metaphor for the interdependence of various species, and to say simply that, we're part of this web of life. And so that is the sculpture that resulted. It's steel rod welded together with a kind of a suit of clothing made of nylon tulle. And each morning we would take butterflies that we had bred from the butterfly machine in the adjacent room and put them inside this figure where they would spend some number of hours before kind of exiting the figure through the head area. Next slide. And that's a detail of that. One of the big takeaways, probably the largest takeaway for me in this project, was that it is extremely difficult to create an artificial habitat for any kind of life form. And I mean, the struggle to, it was a tremendous struggle to do that, really, much harder than I ever expected it to be. And that, led to an understanding that, the web of the natural world is so complex, and the interrelations between all the various components are really too complex to get a handle on, and you can't replicate it. So that, there are many examples of captive breeding programs that are used in conservation to try to maintain an endangered population of a certain species. And those are really a poor substitute for simply not destroying the habitat that's leading to this endangered situation in the first place. Next slide. All right, so here's a second project I'll speak quickly about. And this this backs up to 1986, post Hurricane Katrina. After Katrina, I was really interested in going down to New Orleans and getting my feet on the ground there and trying to understand what had happened in the city. It got me thinking about the idea of a mobile artist studio, which could be deployed to post-disaster settings that would allow artists to kind of embed and be in place and respond to a particular situation. Most of the artists in New Orleans were displaced, so that they did not have the opportunity to stay and and add their creative voices to the response to Katrina. So what's pictured here is a Gulfstream Cavalier trailer. It's a 30-foot park style trailer manufactured by this company in Indiana. And that company was hired by FEMA to produce 50,000 so-called FEMA trailers. The story behind all this is long and would make for a really good sort of anthropological dissertation, PhD dissertation by some young anthropologist at some point. But I won't go too deeply into it, except to say that this company had never made more than 5,000 trailers in a year. What they had done was make a significant campaign contribution to George Bush. And so they were awarded a $500 million contract to build 50,000 trailers. Next slide. Those trailers had massive problems with off-gassing of urea formaldehyde in the heat of New Orleans, and many people got sick. There was a big class action lawsuit. FEMA basically pulled all the trailers back in an attempt to keep the plaintiffs from being able to obtain air samples from inside the FEMA trailers as part of their lawsuit. Anyway, I decided to take one of those trailers and rebuild it as a sustainable structure off-grid with wind and solar power. And I was able to solicit donations of all the kind of currently available green building materials from a number of generous sources. And that resulted in this kind of design and build project, which I called Emergency Response Studio. It was initially exhibited as part of the Prospect One exhibition in New Orleans in the lower Ninth Ward. And then it moved around New Orleans. So here it is in front of the museum there. Next slide. And here's the interior. I mean, these original trailers were really toxic tin cans. They were just awful structures. And my idea was to just kind of open the thing up, bring in as much light and air as possible, make the structure as expansive as possible, and to build it with sustainable products. So for instance, the insulation in this thing is made out of recycled blue jeans. The flooring is made from linseed oil. The cabinetry is made out of bamboo, et cetera. And there were a lot of sort of recycled materials as well. Again, I was really interested in this idea of artists being able to embed themselves, much like the war artists, this tradition of war artists embedding with the troops that started with Winslow Homer. And I think that given the climate disruption and the effects that it's having in terms of making, for instance, the hurricane season, much more deadly, the idea of artists being able to be part of a team of first responders in post-disaster settings is very interesting to me. And so this was a kind of a prototype of one way to do that. It's pictured here in the lower Ninth Ward in 2007, so a couple of years after Hurricane Katrina, and there were still hundreds of people living in FEMA trailers in the damaged parts of New Orleans at that point. And one of the things that brought a smile to my face was that many of these residents who were living in FEMA trailers came to New Orleans and visited this trailer, they were in New Orleans, they'd visit this trailer and their eyes would just light up and they'd say, this is what these trailers should be like. Has FEMA contacted you yet? And I said, no, not yet. And one guy said, look, I have 2 FEMA trailers sitting on my front yard. I'll trade you even for both of them for this one. So I think that may be the last slide. Let's see. Oh, one more. Okay. So very quickly, one of the things I think about and try to do as an artist is to work with children, because I think that kids, especially younger kids, and I have a 10-year-old who I worry about a great deal in this regard. This generation is going to really have to confront problems that I think we are not even able to imagine in terms of what's going to result from, anthropomorphic climate disruption. And I'm thinking primarily about mass migration that I think is going to, cause millions of people to have to move. I mean, if you think about what we went through just with the Syrian refugees in the last three or 4 years and multiply that by an order of magnitude. I mean, when we're talking about 1 million people migrating or 5 million people migrating, I think the socio-political and geopolitical implications of that are going to be something we can't even imagine. So the one thought I have about raising a 10-year-old and about his generation is that these kids need to be as resourceful as possible and as adaptable as possible. And yet, because they're growing up in a world of screens, many of them don't know the difference between a wood screw and a bolt, And so I work with kids to try to give them some basic understanding of how to use tools, because I think that can be a part of being adaptable. We are upstate now and hoping to be able to get a building here in this little Rust Belt town that we're in, and to create a whole world of programming to do this with kids up here. That's about all I have right now. Thank you.
Great. Hi again, everybody. So we're going to talk a little bit, and I encourage you, because I know it takes a few seconds to sort of get there, because in our Zoom world, Q&A has this extra step. But rather than just raising your hand, please feel free to start putting questions into that Q&A field, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. Thank you. So I wanted to just, start out by asking what I think is, one of the really big questions here, and this goes to any of you, maybe all of you, but how can art, or in what way as an artist do you see your place within these larger climate issues? And I think Shelley referenced this also, but what are the ways in which art can have an impact that maybe other types of outreach or other types of ways of people coming into the climate crisis or environmental crises might not?
I can just start quickly. I think art inspired me to get into this career and sort of decide to become a sci artist or an artist informed by science. I think just growing up in San Francisco and going to the California Academy of Sciences and also the SF MoMA, I think I had a exposure to art and to visual media, even if it was dioramas at the Natural History Museum. It's still a visual representation of something that helps you understand it in a visceral way. I think I'm more of a three-dimensional learner, and so sculpting the organisms I was studying and kind of understanding the impacts that humans are having on ecosystems, somehow that was too conceptual for me until I started actually putting it in three-dimensional form. And I think that can be really impactful for people that relate in that same way.
I can see that also in your work. I mean, in this real specificity and this real, level of detail. I know for you, you were talking about, well, I didn't get them exactly right. And then to any other observer who's not you, it seems, quite close. And like, it's really brought you to a place where you've really had to learn as much as you can in order to produce what you have.
Yeah, definitely. I think that can be a main source of inspiration. And then I think art can just kind of open up possibilities for things that you may not have thought of otherwise. Like I could never be as creative as nature. So I'm always finding new things to give me inspiration. And I think hopefully people see that in the work too.
I agree. I just want to add to that I think, especially in terms of your work, like it's giving people access to something they might not see, right? And in a very kind of special way. And I think, we can ask people to see things in a different way as artists, and also have a sort of flexibility in terms of, what we can show. There isn't like the same, there can be an urgency. There might not be that same speed with which, say, a nonprofit has to operate. So there's also that ability to do things at a different speed, which I think is really interesting in terms of art's potential.
And I'll jump in. I think also that art really can explore possibilities, right? And suggest a world of possibilities that might not be apparent otherwise. I hope just in my own work, that if I can transform a littered can into, a flock of butterflies, that the viewer looks at that and says, wow, well, if this is possible, what else is possible? So I think I think this as a kind of an exploration of possibility.
Yeah, Paul, I think that's something that you said also really resonated with me in terms of like the size of an ecosystem and making something that's like a human-made ecosystem and how it kind of can fail, or it can bring about a different form of access. And I think about this a lot in terms of the scale of a human-created ecosystem, and how you have sort of the ability to see something that's really macroscopic in scale on a almost microscopic plane. And I think that can be really profound. Like the size ability, you can see when something goes wrong, you can kind of figure out how to fix it. So you could imagine sort of scaling that up to the world that we live in, and in a way that I think art can do really generatively.
And Paul, I think something you said is something I think about a lot. And I think has a lot to do with art, this idea of reminding ourselves that we are animals, right? And all of these different ways into that, I think is, the more we can not have this feeling of human exceptionalism, right? Or that we're outside of it, or, just get inside the AC and be fine. I think the better, right? That it is, we are part of this, larger system or macro system. I think that's great. Which, Mary, leads me to think about the ways in which you've really lived it in certain senses, right? And these sort of these spaces that you've created for people to come in and act on, be it you or someone else, I think are having been to Swale and visited it with you. I mean, it's amazing. It's an incredible feat, but it's also a real gesture and invitation to people. And I guess I also, in thinking about it, you said you started working on projects like this in 2009. And I guess I was wondering, there's so much collaboration in all three of your work. And then specifically with this, how have you found that the sort of more government bodies or kind of bureaucratic institutions that you have worked with and reached out to, how has that changed? Can we see anything hopeful there?
I think I have a few different examples, and let me try to think about how to answer that really concisely. But I think with the water pot, that was such a difficult project coming into working in public space without any real experience, and asking everybody I met, like, what I needed to make this happen in public space, and everybody saying, you need this, 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 and the permit list was like 19 permits that were incredibly difficult to get. And for me, it was sort of like, it almost felt absurd, but I just kept going through this process of trying to, hear what would be asked of it next before it could become something real. And I think with Swale, I didn't even know if it would become real, but I think with Swale, I sort of had the idea, I knew what the essential things were that needed to happen before this could be in public space. So I think having that experience was helpful. But then I've also seen projects that have really sort of blown my mind in terms of utilizing public space in the temporary public art permit, which has been really profound. I'm thinking about this one project that I'll share quickly. It was called Paths to Pier 42, and it was done by 6 community groups in the Lower East Side, and they were looking at this Pier 42, that was used as sort of a collection ground after Hurricane Sandy for boats that had washed up, and its potential was to become a condo. And these groups got together and they said, we're going to utilize this temporary public art permit. And they did projects over the course of 3 years that just brought enough people to that space and galvanized enough support to turn it into a public park, which is what it is right now. And I think that there are some great examples of utilizing those structures in really inventive ways and ways that can change the way public space its function.
Great, thank you. Paul, I was wondering, you said something really nice about artists as being part of a team of first responders and the kind of power of that. And I was wondering, when, thinking about this project in Katrina, what were some of what was one of the most inspiring moments or uses that you found people came to the mobile studio to do?
Well, the studio really was exhibited primarily just as a prototype and as a structure and as again, an exercise in possibility, like what could a FEMA trailer be? Mm-hmm. So it wasn't really used by artists during that exhibition there. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that was pretty interesting was that it went on to an empty lot in the lower 9th Ward initially. And there was a house next door that was being reconstructed, and there was no power available in the lower 9th Ward. I mean, even in places 2 years after the storm, the power grid was still gone. So the carpenters were using a generator, which died. And we basically, using the photovoltaic system and the wind turbine, ran extension cords from the trailer to their house. And they were able to power their power tools, just off the power from the trailer. So at least, we were able to demonstrate that was a viable kind of thing.
Thank you. Yeah. Great. How do you all think about audience? I think I'm looking through the chat here, the Q&A here from our audience, and this is kind of a way in which I'm bringing together a few questions that I feel like are in there, but either who is your audience or how do you bring your audience in, and what types of, are you looking for, are you looking for sort of connection with them, or in what way do you think about how your work interacts with an audience?
I can start with that. I think I love finding surprising places to put my work. That's why I try to show my work in lots of public places and even government buildings, because I think if it's out of the setting of a traditional art gallery wall or something like that, then it may be more unexpected and people may start asking more questions about what it means and hopefully start that conversation. And I think also kids are a really great audience to have with work like this, because they can kind of interpret it in all kinds of crazy ways. And it's always fun to do workshops and get kids with their hands in the clay and really start talking about how to build corals, because once you start paying attention to what they look like, then you start understanding what they are, that they're animals, and then that starts that conversation too.
Thank you. Anyone else on audience?
Yeah, I mean, I think participation is really what drives me in these projects. I think the possibility of chance and things really changing and people contributing to these projects in different ways is what I think makes me want to engage in them and do them really. So I think it's a big part of sculpture for me.
Yeah, and I think the broadest possible audience is what I'm after. I mean, everything, as Courtney said, kids, but right up through, formal art institutions and everything in between. I did have a filmmaking teacher back in art school, and I was talking with him about, trying to make a film, on a particular political topic. And he kind of scolded me. He said, look, art isn't really good at this. If you want to do that, you want to work in popular music, And so I do think, realistically, we have a pretty limited audience, really. I mean, we exist in a pretty rarefied art world. And it is a challenge to broaden that audience, I think, at least in my mind.
Thank you. I see a question here from Alexandra at the Climate Museum, and I was actually thinking of that museum as kind of another sort of place that's doing great work. And this question is exactly what I think of when I think of them. How do you balance hope and despair? And I think that's something that is, artists in your field, that's something worth grappling with.
Definitely. Yeah, I did that as like the focus of my master's thesis. I interviewed artists inspired by the environment and marine biologists and researchers about the potential for art to inspire ocean conservation. And the main result of all those interviews was really that doom and gloom doesn't work. It often just turns people off and makes them look away because it feels like too big of a problem to solve. And if you give people hope and personal connection, that's where it can really make a difference.
Anyone else on that one?
Sure. I mean, I think about a quote by Edward Galeano, who said he saw some graffiti on the side of a building that said, "Let's leave pessimism for better times." And that's really how I think about it.
And I think, just to echo what I said earlier, we're really engaged in this exploration of possibility, right? And for me, the what's at the heart of that is hope that things can change. And I don't know, I don't know that as an artist I can change anyone else, but I can change one very small part of the world by changing myself, and remaining hopeful.
Great. I'm going to turn it back to Shelley in a moment, but just to ask you all, is there anything else that you feel like you want to make sure the audience has heard? Mary, you're on mute.
I've just been thinking about something that a friend of mine said about, like, the next phase of Swale is to be determined, and people would love to see it exist for longer in a place and take it over. And my friend Lonnie said to me, I know a project has been successful when people don't remember that I was involved in it anymore. And I think, like, there's something to be said something really important about the project's longevity and about maintenance and about it moving on. And I would just love to add that.
I think that's really beautiful. Thank you. Well, thanks to all of you so much for sharing your work with us. I'm sorry that I know there are a bunch more questions, but I encourage the conversation to continue afterwards between maybe between the artists with social media feeds or maybe between interested participants. Thanks to all of you. And Shelley, can I hand it back over to you for goodbye?
You can. First, I want to thank all of our artists and our moderator today for being here. We're just so happy to have you. I would like to follow up on what Nora said, that we have a lot of people who have asked questions. So I urge our audience to go to marymattingly.com, courtneymadison.com, and paulvolinsky.com to look at their websites, and you can contact them with your questions, and I'm sure they'll be happy to answer you. Again, thank you so much. We're really, as I said, honored to have all of you. But in closing, I'd just like to say that one of the most direct and meaningful ways that you can be involved in the environmental movement is to become a member of Earthsay.org. So just go on Earthsay.org and click on Become a Member. You could do that before the year's end. That would be great. If you want to know more about Artists for the Earth, you can see our page on Earthsay.org. Go to that site, and if you want to look at our gallery there, and if you're an artist and you want to send us some art, just click on Register. You'll receive an email from us and asking for your art, and then we'll mount it on our digital Artists for the Earth gallery. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And in closing, it's been absolutely great. It's been a privilege to be with you all. And thanks for being here with us today.
Thank you. See you all soon, I hope.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.